The #3 House Republican, Steve Scalise, is fighting for his political life after admitting he addressed a conference of neo-Nazis and white supremacists back in 2002 while a Louisiana state senator. That conference was sponsored by the European American Unity and Rights Organization, or EURO, a hate group founded by former KKK leader and the nation's most famous white supremacist, David Duke. Scalise has attributed his attendance at the conference to a lack of knowledge about the group, today releasing a statement saying, "It was a mistake I regret, and I emphatically oppose the divisive racial and religious views groups like these hold. I am very disappointed that anyone would try to infer otherwise for political gain. As a Catholic, these groups hold views that are vehemently opposed to my own personal faith, and I reject that kind of hateful bigotry." But the whip seemed less concerned about hateful bigotry back in 1999 when he and Duke were potential rivals for an open House seat. A roll call article from the Time documents that, quote, State Representative Steve Scalise said he embraces many of the same conservative views as Duke, but is far more viable. Quote, "The novelty of David Duke has worn off," said Scalise. "The voters in this district are smart enough to realize that they need to get behind someone who not only believes in the issues they care about, but also can get elected." Duke has proven that he can't get elected, and that's the first and most important thing. Joining me now is Senior Fellow at the Southern Poverty Law Center and Editor-in-Chief of the Intelligence Report, Mark Potok. Mark, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, John.
You wrote today in a blog post that, quote, "Scalise's claim of ignorance is almost impossible to believe." Why?
Well, because, as you mentioned in the intro, David Duke is now and was then by far the best-known white supremacist in the United States, and especially so in Louisiana. To me, it is simply beyond the realm of belief that a Louisiana-based politician with national aspirations like Steve Scalise could not know who David Duke was when Duke ran for governor of that state and came perilously close to winning in 1991, was always in the news there, as was his organization, EURO. That was the organization he formed 2 years earlier under a slightly different name in 2000.
EURO's not so active, but the number of hate groups has risen considerably since then, hasn't it?
That is true. The radical right in general has really exploded in size, in particular since the fall of 2008, when, of course, Barack Obama came onto the national political scene. We've seen hate groups go from about 600 to over 1,000, close to 1,000 now, and militia groups, or so-called patriot groups, go from about 150 to close to 1,200. So the growth has been just exponential.
And I think, yes, from your organization, Southern Poverty Law Center, there's been a 56% increase since 2000 in the number of hate groups in the United States. You've also said that Representative Scalise should resign his leadership post. Why do you think that's so important?
Well, I think that, you know, it's impossible to know what the man was thinking at the time, whether he actually shared some of the beliefs of this hate group or was simply willing to pander to very well-known white supremacists and neo-Nazis in order to gain votes. But I think it was certainly one of those two. I think this comes at a time when the Republican Party is making quite a lot of noise about reaching out to minorities, and has made some efforts to do so. This seems obviously poisonous to that effort, not to mention to the workings of democracy in general.
Making a lot of noise, but not being very successful at it. Mark Potok with the Southern Poverty Law Center, thank you.
A pleasure. Thanks for having me.
This afternoon, House Republican leadership finally weighed in on the Scalise situation this afternoon with a full-throated defense of their colleagues, said Speaker Boehner. More than a decade ago, Representative Scalise made an error in judgment, and he was right to acknowledge it was wrong and inappropriate. Like many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, I know Steve to be a man of high integrity and good character. He has my full confidence as our whip, and he will continue to do great and important work for all Americans. The show of support for Scalise came after the speaker spoke to New York Congressman Michael Grimm yesterday, according to reports. Grimm then resigned his seat days after pleading guilty to felony tax evasion, a fate which, for now at least, the number 3 Republican in the House appears to have avoided. Joining me now is White House correspondent at the Huffington Post, Jennifer Bendry, and congressional reporter for the Washington Post, Ed O'Keefe. Thank you both for being here. Ed, I'm going to start with you. So the leadership standing behind Representative Scalise, was that expected, and what's the calculation here?
Well, the calculation is that for now, at least, Jonathan, there's nothing else here, and that this is an anomaly, that they are standing by him because they believe that he did this one thing. He says it was now a mistake, that he was poorly staffed at the time, and that perhaps he didn't totally understand the origins of the group. But I have a feeling that the moment any other suggestions of either similar appearances or writings or speeches or issues of support for this organization or for something similar surfaces, if it does, and we don't know that it will, that you'll almost immediately start to see members of both parties call for him to at least relinquish his leadership position. And talking to some Republicans today, they say, look, if this gets worse, at the least he has to do what Trent Lott did back in 2002 when he had made those laudatory comments about Strom Thurmond's presidential campaigns and drop the leadership position but stay in Congress. But again, as you read there, just about every Republican leader at this point is on the record, and the moment that statement came out, rank and file Republicans started returning phone calls saying much the same, that they stand by him and they see no reason for him to step down.
Jen, Jake Sherman at Politico is reporting that Scalise wasn't meeting much resistance from his colleagues. Now, isn't this one of the reasons that the Republican Party is having such a hard time reaching out to people of color? That this is one of the reasons why folks have so much concern about the party?
It absolutely is, but I think in this case, the fact that Speaker Boehner stepped out today and firmly stated his support for Scalise keeping his position, followed by moments later, the House Majority Whip, Kevin McCarthy, putting out a statement saying the same thing, and then Scalise putting out a statement saying that he does regret that speech. I think what you're seeing is they're trying to wrap this up really quick. It was a one-time thing. Congressman Scalise didn't know what he was at somehow. So, this does go against their efforts to reach out to minorities, but at the same time, the way they're packaging this is he didn't know, let's move on, there's nothing to see here, he's a good man.
And on that point, Jonathan, just real quick, Mia Love, who is one of the 2 Republican African Americans who will be taking a seat in Congress next week, she's representing a Utah district, she put out a statement this afternoon saying that in all her interactions with him, she's seen no reason to believe that he's racist or that he would be backing the beliefs of this group. So from at least one of the 2, he's now got support. And they've been heralding her candidacy, and that it will hurt another Republican from Texas who is black, and both of them had sort of been under the gun to sort of say something or at least acknowledge that this was happening and that perhaps either they would support him or not next week.
Well, another person who put out a statement is Congressman Cedric Richmond, who African-American Democrat, who expressed support for Congressman Scalise. How important is that kind of support from Congressman Richmond and Congresswoman Mia Love to someone like Scalise? And Congressman Richmond did it rather early in this story's process.
No, I think it's critical, and I know it was a widely circulated and widely seen quote among Democrats who I think were poised to do a little bit more than they have in calling for Scalise to step down. Now, look, from a very crass political perspective, the longer this festers, the better it is for Democrats. So perhaps that's part of the reason why they didn't want to do this. But the fact that Richmond, spoke as a witness on behalf of Scalise as a hometown guy and said, I know them, I know his family, and I have no reason to believe that he believes in this group's tenets, that almost immediately put a damper on whatever Democrats might have done. Not only is he a Democrat from Louisiana, but he is black, and he's the only one at this point. And so they saw that as a message to perhaps hold fire.
Yeah, very interesting. And, Jen, you actually talked to David Duke yesterday. What did you guys talk about? What did he say?
He said a lot of things I can't say on this program, but one thing that he said was that he does know Steve Scalise just a little bit. He's met him a few times. And something probably that Republican leaders did not want to be hitting the press was that David Duke says, hey, Steve Scalise, he seems like a pretty nice guy, good family man, I support some of the things he does. The fact that he's out there saying anything positive about Steve Scalise right now, as Scalise is trying to get away, as far away from this 2002 speech, is not what they want to be hearing.
Hey, Jan, you said that David Duke said a lot of things you could not say. Could you characterize them?
Let's just say that he really, really does not like Israel. And he made it clear that he was glad that Eric Cantor is no longer in House leadership.
How on earth does Israel come into play in a discussion about a Louisiana congressman in a speech given in 2002?
David Duke was telling me that he believes that the only true racist, supremacist state is Israel. And that was where attention should really be focused right now, on Israel.
That's pretty incredible. I mean, it sort of reminds me of the speech that I read that he gave at the time, where there's like a full-on attack on Israel in that speech. But, you know, what happened there in 2002, where Scalise speaks to this group, yet the Cubs minor league baseball team was aware enough to decide that rather than stay at that hotel in Louisiana, they were going to go elsewhere. So if a team in 2002, a minor league team in 2002, could be so aware, how is it possible that then State Representative Scalise wasn't?
I think part of the defense for him, Jonathan, and this is only based on reporting, is that he says he wasn't perhaps as well staffed as the baseball team. He only had one aide. He didn't have a scheduler. I think he said something to the effect of, "I wish I had Google back then in 2002." So that might have been part of it. You know, I can tell you that my colleagues have spoken with some of those folks close to David Duke. One of them was a neighbor of Mr. Scalise at the time, so there's some suggestion that perhaps he might have known a little bit more about this group. But again, for now, the majority whip says that he didn't, and that he considers it a mistake. And we'll see. You know, I think part of the test of this really is the fact that this is a holiday week. Washington isn't in session. Congress isn't in session. Most Americans aren't paying attention. But if they do find out about it a little more, if something else comes forward, will that become a bigger deal? It certainly would, and it would be a major misstep for Republicans as they take full control of Congress next week.
Right. Jen, I know did you want to get in real fast?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, I guess we should give Steve Scalise the benefit of the doubt that he did not know what euro was. But it is sort of hilarious that he is citing the fact that he couldn't use Google back in 2002 to potentially look up the group that he was going to speak to, because I did a little research before coming on here. Google was actually created in 1998, had been up and running for 4 years, and was used, it was the top third, the number 3 search engine by everybody on the internet. So, I mean, it's one thing if he truly didn't know what this group was about, but to say that he didn't have Google at his fingertips is just not, that's pretty flimsy.
Yeah, not very credible. Jen Bendry and Ed O'Keefe, thank you.
Good to see you, John.
Just lack of knowledge about the group, today releasing a statement saying, "It was a mistake I regret, and I emphatically oppose the divisive racial and religious views groups like these hold. I am very disappointed that anyone would try to infer otherwise for political gain. As a Catholic, these groups hold views that are vehemently opposed to my own personal faith, and I reject that kind of hateful bigotry." But the whip seemed less concerned about hateful bigotry back in 1999 when he and Duke were potential rivals for an open House seat. A roll call article from the Time documents that, quote, State Representative Steve Scalise said he embraces many of the same conservative views as Duke, but is far more viable. Quote, "The novelty of David Duke has worn off," said Scalise. "The voters in this district are smart enough to realize that they need to get behind someone who not only believes in the issues they care about, but also can get elected." Duke has proven that he can't get elected, and that's the first and most important thing.
Especially so in Louisiana. To me, it is simply beyond the realm of belief that a Louisiana-based politician with national aspirations like Steve Scalise could not know who David Duke was when Duke ran for governor of that state and came perilously close to winning in 1991, was always in the news there, as was his organization, Euro. That was the organization he formed 2 years earlier under.
The number 3 House Republican, Steve Scalise, is fighting for his political life after admitting he addressed a conference of neo-Nazis and white supremacists back in 2002 while a Louisiana state senator. That conference was sponsored by the European American Unity and Rights Organization, or Euro, a hate group founded by former KKK leader and the nation's most famous white supremacist, David Duke. Scalise has attributed his attendance at the conference to a lack. Joining me now is senior fellow at the Southern Poverty Law Center and editor-in-chief of the Intelligence Report, Mark Potok. Mark, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Jonathan.
You wrote today in a blog post that, quote, Scalise's claim of ignorance is almost impossible to believe. Why?
Well, because, as you mentioned in the intro, David Duke is now and was then by far the best-known white supremacist in the United States.